So just a little bit about me first. I'm an application security engineer at Seek. So I help Seek and the developers there try and secure their products to make sure the bad guys can't break in and steal our customer data, essentially. I used to be a developer as well, and I run a bunch of other things. So this survey link, if you've got Messenger on Facebook, you can actually take a photo of it. And I got this same picture at the end of the slide deck, so you can like kind of take a photo and leave some feedback as well. It'd be really good. I run the OWASP Melbourne chapter in Melbourne, obviously. So we do monthly meetups to teach developers and students and new people to security about all things security, specifically application security. So if you are from Melbourne, you can check that out. And we also have a Australia-wide AppSec conference coming up as well, which we're running for the second time this year, which will be pretty good. So we've got a good lineup. So that's a bit about me. Are you guys all developers, or so you're technical in general? Anyone who works in security? No, didn't think so. That's all right. Awesome. So you all build products. Is that right? Okay, cool. So today, today's agenda doesn't work. Sorry, just give me a second. Dun, dun. Oh, there we go, sweet. Just going to talk quickly about what motivates an attacker and why we're here in the first place and why security kind of matters and some of the trends and breaches that have happened recently. Then we're going to go through why that's still happening in this day and age and why this transition to building faster software, agile, DevOps, all those kind of buzzwords is making it a little bit more difficult, but then how we can actually solve that problem as well. So that's kind of one of the things Seek's been trying to do over the last few years, is to try and scale security as we move into a world where we're deploying multiple times a day and lots of different teams doing their own autonomous things. So talk a little bit about that. And then the main focus obviously will be on bug bounty programs. Has anyone heard of a bug bounty program? Cool. So I'll go through that, what it is, what are the options out there for you guys as well if you want to try and bring that into your company as well. And then a bit about our journey at Seek over the last year and a half since we've had the bug bounty program up and running. And then I guess some examples of some of the submissions, probably the more severe ones we've had at Seek as well, so that should be pretty interesting as well. So who can think of one thing that comes to mind when you talk about a hacker? Like, what are they normally after when you think of like the guy in the hoodie? What do they actually want? Money, right? So money is the first one. Is there any other ones you can think of? Chaos. Anything they can sell. So a lot of the time it does come to money. It's not just about stealing physical cash. It's also about blackmail and all these other different motivations. But a lot of it does come back to money or cash. But there are a few others. So like, it could be politically motivated. It could be state-sponsored. We've obviously heard of like NSA and Russia and China are always trying to attack us and things like that. And religious views as well, so terrorist groups and things like that. So there are a few other things, but the majority that we have to worry about, especially if you're in a typical organization that's not morally sensitive in any way, just a standard organization producing products, normally it's the money side of things that we have to worry about the most. If you get to the point where you're starting to worry about your NSAs and your state-sponsored actors, then that's a very different kettle of fish and something that you have to work really hard to be able to protect against. So unfortunately, hackers are here to stay and they seem to be persisting. I don't know, obviously I'm a bit biased because I'm in the security industry, so I hear about this stuff all day, but I feel like the security breaches that happen are getting a bit more attention from mainstream media. That's obviously because they're affecting a lot more people as well. So this is a recent one that's happened locally in Australia with Red Cross Blood Service had their SQL database backup publicly exposed to the internet and someone found it. Luckily, I think it was okay because it was a concerned citizen who did find it. We don't know if it had been found previously by an attacker, and that was reported to Troy. And his website have been pwned, which is a good thing. We'll get back to that example a bit later when I talk about some of the principles we can focus on to secure our products. This happened a little while ago now, but Gumtree was hacked, username and password stolen. Yahoo, do you guys hear about this one? Or multiple of them? So Yahoo, that was a pretty big one. 1 billion records were stolen. So that data was probably a bit old because it happened quite a long time ago, but we only found out about it recently, and that tends to happen a lot. LinkedIn was the same case. That actually, their whole database got stolen in 2013 or so, but we only found out about it a few years ago. So these things have a bit of a delay. Yahoo's an interesting case because they have so many breaches that they have a whole Wikipedia page to keep track of them all now. So yeah, that's pretty interesting. And this is a really cool site that actually shows you all the different breaches around the world by time. So this is the latest ones that have happened. So you can see from 2015 to 16 and to now, we have quite a lot, and you can barely see all of them there. And the bubbles show how big the breach was, or how many records were breached. And you can actually go and click on each one of these. It's an interactive map, and it shows you more information about each breach. So yeah, if you just Google world's biggest data breaches, you can get to this site, which is pretty cool. So what happens with this data? I mean, we mentioned the motivations were mainly money driven. So if you're an attacker and you steal someone's name, where they live, like all this kind of personal information, what do you think is the best way to monetize that information? Sell it back to you, so blackmail, I guess you'd consider that, yep. It's a bit harder to scale maybe. I mean, people are doing that a little bit with the ransomware stuff, right? That's essentially what that is. So you have this thing that gets installed on your computer, it encrypts all your files, and then ransoms the data back to you. So that's, yep. And that's worked very, very well these days. So. Anything else? Come on, put your hacker hats on. Identity theft, so using the data to get bank accounts in their name, credit cards in their name. Surprising how little information you need to get that to happen. That also puts the risk back on the attacker who breached the data. So they often look for other ways of getting money at a lower risk way. So one of the popular ones at the moment is on the dark web, so through Tor hidden services and all that kind of stuff. So this is an example of Australian records. You can actually request certain people to see if they have records on particular users. And we're talking not a lot of money, like this is 25 USD per record, and you potentially get a lot of this type of information. So this is currently being sold, and it has been for a long time, but I guess it's getting worse as we put more and more information online. So all the way from Australian people, obviously, to other countries, and even your typical like login bank account details. This normally gets stolen by, an attacker sends out this massive phishing campaign and grabs all these users' details by sending them links to fake websites where they type their credentials in. And that's $30 a pop. And they've been tested, in this case, unchecked balance, so they don't know how big the balance is. But this is actively happening. So why do you think this is happening? Can you give me a few examples, maybe in your organization, where maybe you haven't done something to do with security, or it's kind of been put on the backlog, or hasn't really been prioritized? That's fair enough, right? Like that happens. It's not an unusual situation. It happens at Seek as well. Because at the end of the day, companies are designed, or they're there to make money, and they're there to sell a product. So security is helping them. It's kind of like an insurance, I guess. Along with other types of departments as well. We're all kind of helping the company sell products. So you have to get that balance between doing enough security so that the bad guys go elsewhere and try and attack someone else. That's essentially what you're trying to do. But you don't want to do too much that you're taking up all the time, so you can't actually make products. So if you think back, and maybe some organizations are still here, but I feel like most organizations are moving a lot faster and moving into this new world of software development. So you used to have 3 to 6 month deploy cycles one software stack per company. All these everything was very slow. So you had a bit of time to consider security within that period, and you have like Gantt charts and you put your security somewhere in places. So this might have been what it looked like in a typical organization where you have maybe a manual security review. You might just have a pen test that gets done right at the end as you're about to release to production. And then you haven't really allowed time for any fixes in case there's any big fixes in there. So that's kind of where security kind of initiated from. But now we're moving faster. We're moving, like with agile methodologies, DevOps, CI/CD, all that kind of stuff. We're now deploying a lot faster. We're moving a lot faster. So how do you fit that same level of security in this new world? And that's kind of part of what we're trying to get at today. So this is actually about a year and probably almost 2 years ago now, this graph. So I haven't actually updated it recently, but I'm sure it's a lot more than 30 times a day. But this is how many deploys we were doing at Seek. Essentially, over across a lot of different streams. So that number is actually probably a lot lower, a lot higher now. But you can see that if you tried to put a manual pen test inside each one of those 30 deploys before they went to production, you just can't do it. It's not physically possible. So how do you scale security so that it can fit into this type of environment? What about this one? So you have number of breaches. I know this is a pretty graph. I'm not very good with this type of thing. And then unreasonable security controls. So why would the number of controls increasing but the attacks also increasing? Because normally you'd think it's the opposite, right? Normally you think more controls, the more secure we are. But what's the key word here that I've highlighted? Unreasonable. So what do people do when they don't like something? They're going to bypass it. So this is, you can't see it very well, but there's a gate here. But the gate is obviously, you can just go around on the grass. So you can see all the tracks are going around the gate instead of going through it. So if you put all these controls in place, but they're not going to fit within the current model, the current environment in which you're working in, then there's no point having those controls just to tick a box or to say, yeah, we're doing this thing, but no one's actually really doing it, or it's not a very effective control. So we want to move away from that. The other thing is, who has security as part of their performance review? Awesome, one person, yes. It's a very unusual thing for a tech company to have security as one of their responsibilities. A lot of larger organizations in Silicon Valley might have this kind of mature structure, but a lot of the time the security falls on the security team, if there is a security team. If there isn't one, then who knows where it falls. So it's this kind of weird thing where it doesn't really fit within the same model. There's also a pretty big skill shortage at the moment, especially within Australia, of people who understand security. So that's one of the bigger problems, is it's really hard to hire people to do this kind of work as well. So even when organizations are really trying to push and hire people to do this work, it's very hard to, even Google is struggling, so that's a good sign that things are not going so well. And this is just obviously a typical ratio. It might even be worse than this, depending on which organization you work at and what their risk appetite is and all this kind of stuff. So this is what it is essentially at Seek at the moment. But that's not too bad really when you consider other companies. And we also have a larger security team. But still, how do two people try and secure the products of all these different people who are producing code on a daily basis? So the idea is to try and get that 140 people to try and do some of that security work. And that's what we're trying to do a little bit at Seek. The other thing is it's getting a lot more complex. So a lot of and this is a Slack message that Julian Berton, one of the other colleagues we have at Seek, he posted the other day. So this just gives you an indication of how many different frameworks and languages we're currently using ballpark. So it's not just the one software stack anymore. So now we have to consider security for all these different frameworks, different languages. And that just adds to the complexity, especially when you couple that with this situation. So if the developers and everyone else in the organization aren't considering security as part of their assessment criteria to say, hey, should we use this new software stack? Should we use this new framework, this new library? What are the security implications? Do we have tooling that can support these new frameworks and libraries? So that's probably an important thing to start thinking about before it gets a bit out of control. So what is the solution then? Can we make our web apps 100% secure? Is there a way? There is one way. Don't put them on the web. So turn it off, shut down everything, no customers, no problem, right? That's essentially the only way to get 100% secure. So apart from 100%, we want to get pretty close to it. So one thing we can do, and these are some obviously pretty high level principles, but a lot of them are pretty self-explanatory. The first one is what I'm going to cover a little bit today, but there's obviously minimizing attack surface, keeping things simple. So even getting rid of your tech debt can be really helpful with security as well. So you can actually do a lot of work security into your business cases to improve other parts of the business as well. But if we consider the defense in depth analogy, I like to use the car safety analogy. So in a car, you don't just have one control that protects you when you have a crash. You have multiple controls in place: ABS, airbags, seat belts, crumple zones. And all these things are in place to protect you, not just one control. So it's a similar analogy for security. So if we have a look at this example of the Red Cross breach that happened, here are some of the things that they could have done to potentially prevent this from happening. So if they did one or two of these things, it probably would have prevented that breach from happening in the first place, let alone if they had all these different things all together. It paints a very better picture. So in this case, they had an SQL database that was on a web server that was publicly accessible, so it only took someone to scan the IP address looking for .SQL files or .backup files to find this thing. Because the server had directory listing turned on, it wasn't whitelisted, it was publicly accessible, there was no authentication. They might not have had it pen tested. It was a third-party environment who was looking after it. So did you make sure that that third party was looking after your, security as well? So there's lots of different things you can put around it, monitoring and alerting potentially as well to detect access to a server that you don't expect people to be accessing. So there are little quick wins you can do to kind of get there. So how do we integrate these principles into this new world that we're in, software development moving fast? Well, I don't know if you've seen this, but it all starts with the conjoined triangles of success. So first of all, you can see that, no, I'm just joking. I don't know if you guys have seen Silicon Valley. We really need to somehow integrate and add security as part of this DevOps kind of world that we live in. So now, I know you've already got, as a dev, you've now just got lumped with all this new work that you have to do with infrastructure, and you have to set up AWS environments and all this other stuff. But now we also need you to think about security a little bit as well, unfortunately. And hopefully, as the tooling and information online gets better, this shouldn't be that much of a learning curve after a while. But this is really the way we need to go. So at Seek, this is our kind of plan a little bit. It's not by any means complete, but there are different stages of the development lifecycle, and we add security into each one, or trying to add them. I'm not saying we've done all this. It's very difficult to get to this level of maturity. But what I wanted to talk about today is really bug bounty programs. So hopefully this gives you some context around why we considered a bug bounty program, and as you'll see, some of the value we got out of it. It was really quite good. But it is at the very last stage, kind of a similar realm as a pen test. So you do really want to be doing a lot of this other stuff as well, especially the training side of things, and trying to automate as much security into your build pipelines as possible as well. So a bug bounty program is essentially a crowdsourced way of doing security testing, But the other main difference is that instead of paying someone to come in and spend a week of their time and you pay them for that time, you're paying these researchers all around the world to participate in your bug bounty program per bug that they find based on the severity. So if they find a high critical vulnerability, you're going to pay them a lot more than you would if they reported a low one. And if they don't report anything and they've spent a whole week of their time, you don't pay them anything. Which does seem like a little bit unfair sometimes, but that's the incentivized model to incentivize them to keep going and to try and find something if something's there. So from a business point of view, it makes a lot more sense sometimes and can be more cost effective as well. So these researchers are from all the way around the world. We'll see some graphs of where they might come from the most in a second. But it does help us even up the playing field a bit because we can tap into this resource of people who do have the right skill sets. They're diverse, they're constantly looking for these types of issues on other programs, so they replicate that same knowledge. At the end of the day, if we can find all these issues on Seek, that's all we care about. Not if they're using their same skill set to get a lot of money from other companies as well. If they're finding the same vulnerability on multiple sources, that's great for us too. So there are a few companies out there at the moment that help you run these types of programs. Obviously running them from scratch like your Google and Facebook do, it requires a lot of effort, a lot of resources, a big security team. So these guys have come into the scene in the last, say, 3 or 4 years to help companies really just get their foot in the door. You can do really minimal testing to start off with, minimal programs with a small scope. So there are ways of kind of working up to a big bang like we've done. And you can do it obviously like time-based too, so 2 weeks on your production system, or it could be on a testing environment, things like that. But essentially, when the researchers get involved in these programs, they get a brief. So this brief outlines what targets are in scope, so technically they should only kind of test those particular domains. What issues you don't care about, what things you don't want them to test. If you don't want to test for denial of service because you're worried that your service might go down and affect customers, you can put that in there. As we'll see a bit later, they don't always follow these rules, but it's a really good indication and it gets you kind of 80% there, which is really good. And there are a lot of companies at the moment that are doing it. There's about 500 plus programs, and that's growing pretty rapidly every year. Some of these programs are private, so you might not know exactly about a lot of these programs. It's not until they go public where they start getting marketed a bit more. And if you're a researcher on one of these platforms and you have a good reputation score, you start to get invited. So you can actually, some of the benefits of a private program is that you just invite researchers who have a really good reputation, so you're minimizing a lot of the risk of a rogue researcher going and stealing all your data and all these kind of risks that you normally think of when you think of allowing 50 hackers to just test your site. Even the Pentagon has a bug bounty program now, so it's definitely hitting the mainstream. It has proven a success in a lot of different companies, so it's getting a lot of attention from your regular industries now, not just online tech as well. I guess not so surprisingly, there's a large percentage of people from India who are participating in the programs, but also from everywhere else around the world. So it's really getting that untapped resource skills, because you don't really need to be awesome at English speaking to participate in our program. You just have to be an awesome hacker and know how to find cross-site scripting vulnerabilities and all these types of things. So the barrier to entry is really small, so it's all about lowering that friction for these people who have the passion, have the skill set. They just want to test your program and get paid a little bit of money for it as well. So not surprising is the technology industry is probably the leader in bug bounty programs, mainly because they're probably the best equipped to handle programs initially. But these days, those services I was talking about do allow other verticals to get involved in an easier way. So we are starting to see other verticals getting involved as well. And as you can see, it doesn't really matter how big your company is. There's a pretty even distribution of people getting, or companies getting involved in these programs as well. So it's not just for your 5,000 plus employee company. Does anyone have any questions off that? Just feel free to interrupt during.
With the company breakdown, it said that there was technology and then IT and security.
Yeah, so that's probably like consultancy firms and people specifically do. I'm not sure exactly. So this data actually comes from the State of Bug Bounty report.
Okay.
So yeah, might have to refer you to that document. Maybe they have exactly what's going on there. But they produce one of them every year with updated data. And that's through BugCrowd, which is one of those providers. So this is just information from their service as well. It's not global, if that makes sense. Yeah, it's a good point. Probably like IT management, security, services, that kind of thing, rather than products, online technology kind of thing. So just before I get into the journey that we went on at Seek, it is important to ask the question, can I run a bug bounty program? The answer is probably yes, but you do have to ask a lot of these types of questions to make sure the business can handle it. So if you don't have, for example, security aware people to help you fix these issues or triage issues, that might be a little bit of a problem. Maybe you can get a consultant to come in and help you, or maybe the services themselves can direct you a little bit. Because the researchers will give you some information, but they won't give you all the information you need to be able to completely fix and remediate all issues. What is the maturity of your website? So if you haven't had a pen test done or a security test done by a consultant or anything else, and you don't have any other security controls, bug bounty programs might not be the first place to start, because you might run out of money quite quickly if there's a lot of issues that you have to kind of flush out. So it's always important to kind of understand whereabouts your maturity sits before you unleash the crowd, as they say. And the other thing is, can you fix issues within a timely manner? So if you have lots of issues and you have this bug bounty program, as soon as they're found, especially critical ones, you don't really want them to hang around too often. And if you can't fix a critical issue within, say, a week or a month even, and this thing ends up being there for 6 to 12 months, that's a risk, I guess, you have to take. But at least you know about it, so there is definitely a positive outcome there. But if you can't fix these things, the researcher community does start to get a little bit annoyed, and I'll show you an example of that. Also, how fragile your systems are. If you can put a testing environment out publicly so that people can test on that environment rather than your production environment, that's great. Not everyone can do that. We couldn't do that because our environment was so interconnected. We didn't have one testing environment that we were happy to push publicly. So we decided to test on our production websites with a few restrictions here and there so that customers weren't affected. But if you have a really fragile website, and if you ran like a security tool that automatically scanned your site and it brought it down, for example, that happens constantly all the time with these researchers coming on board. So you have to make sure you can handle that.
How did you sort of silo off production, a section of production or whatever, so that the customers weren't affected?
So that's a good question. So obviously one thing you can do is not put it in scope. So in that brief that I mentioned before, you just don't put, if it's on a subdomain, or you could say specifically don't test this thing. You kind of have to segregate it a little bit and have some internal processes sometimes that deal with that type of incident. So for example, we have, at Seek, we obviously post job ads, and we don't want researchers posting fake job ads and hitting real customers. So we have a fraud team internally, and we have a few other processes in place that prevent those ads going to our real customers. So one thing in the brief, we actually say, please only post jobs to this category in this section where we know there's no customers who are applying or searching on those categories. So there are kind of ways around it, but in some cases with one of our products, we had to completely take it off the scope because there was no really easy way of not affecting customers, because it was about purchasing a CV and that would directly hit the customer. So in those cases, bug bounty programs aren't the best solution. So in those cases, best to just get a regular pen test or other security controls in place for that. Yep.
Any reason to not use a staging environment? Like,
It-
if there's a staging, are there any reason to still do in production?
If you have a staging environment and it's publicly accessible, then that's great. You can actually, these services actually do offer like a VPN service where you can direct the researchers internally, but then they have to connect via a VPN, so there's that kind of friction element to it as well. Like, would they test on your site versus testing on another program that's just easy to hit? So we kind of, and again, it's not one size fits all. It really depends on the situation in your company and what you're trying to achieve. But for Seek, we realized it was a lot easier just to lower the barrier completely, test on production systems, and try and cater for those scenarios where we, customer impact and stuff like that.
Was it hard to get management to sign off on hackers to go nuts in production?
Yeah, so it took a lot of investigation, a lot of understanding about what are our risk mitigations. So if I get time later on, I'll definitely release a slide deck anyway, and I have some stuff in the appendix section that goes through the risks associated, like what happens if an attacker steals all your data and puts it on the dark web or whatever. So there's a lot of answers to all those questions, and if you can make the business comfortable that you've thought these through and you have kind of backup strategies, then that puts them a little bit more at ease. Then, So the other thing you can do is run a smaller program, and which is what we did, very limited scope. So you can kind of start very close to a real pen test to get the business comfortable with running these programs. And then, so you don't have to go big bang, public program. Anyone can do it on production systems. You start off smaller, and that's kind of what we did essentially. So we had 50 researchers invited. You can obviously have less than that too. We tested on production. It was only for 2 weeks, and we only had 3 apps in scope for this one. Over the 2 weeks, we had 104 issues reported, and we've obviously had lots of pen tests done in the past as well. So these are uncovering issues that had been there for like 3 years that we never knew about. Some new that had just hit production, like in the last week kind of thing, because we do like lots of deployments. So it was catching everything, and it was very varied. But what you can see here is that there was 40 that were actually triaged. The rest were either duplicates that we already knew about, or they were existing, like kind of won't fix or out of scope kind of issues. So these services help you to triage and deal with the incoming issues, sorry. The other thing to note is like we did get a massive spike when we first started the program in the first few days, but then it kind of petered off. But the interesting thing is the high rated issues didn't really come through until about halfway through the program. And that's obviously for a good reason. Researchers need time to understand your application, really have a look what's available there, and then go deeper on certain issues and then they kind of come up there. So overall we had 3 high issues come up, and those are like really like quite high issues that we definitely cared about. Even the medium ones we really didn't want to get there. We really wanted to fix them pretty soon as well. And then all the other ones were kind of just informational low ones that weren't as severe obviously, but that's a pretty good ratio. Like from a pen test or any other type of security testing, you really want your high quality issues, and getting a quarter or so out of all the issues as quality it's a pretty good ratio. Yep.
How do you agree upon what's high, medium, and low? It's usually when we run pen tests, usually the vendor will tell us that's a high, or medium, or low.
So yeah, there's 2 levels. So first of all, the service, so in this case BugCrowd, and the researcher themselves will rate it based on what they think, but then you always have to re-rate that based on your internal, if you have an internal risk rating. I don't know if you have like a matrix that says if it's going to cause this much damage, what's your risk tolerance as a company, and then kind of re-rate it internally. But it really depends on if you have that skill set in-house and whether you have that matrix and stuff like that. But you can always re-rate them. At the end of the day, it's really just to provide value rather than ticking a box to say, yes, we're secure. So just focus on the impact to the business rather than the actual priority that's given. It's probably a good idea.
Before you were saying that they get paid based on the severity of the bugs they found, or
Yeah, so you re-rate them and then they get paid out at the re-rated severity, if that makes sense. So you make the final call, yeah. So the customer always makes the final call. There is a bit of a to and fro because sometimes it's not as obvious what it is, and there are a few cases. We've had one recently where we end up rating it as a low, but they thought it might have been a high, so it was a bit of an unusual situation. You get those every now and again, but generally speaking, it's pretty easy to understand how bad it is. So the OWASP Top 10, that's an indication of, I don't know if, has everyone heard of the OWASP Top 10? If you haven't, go have a look. It's a really good document to get people started in security. It lists what OWASP and the community think are the highest or most common and most severe issues in the wild. And that's kind of backed up by this data that 97% of all those issues that we found were actually from that top 10. So it's a really good indicator of where to start your training from, where to start teaching all the developers about certain issues. So it's a really good place to start, in other words. The other thing is you invite 50 researchers, but not all of them are going to actually test on your site because they're busy doing other things. A lot of them have day jobs. So out of the 50, we had only 15 people submit something, which indicates that only about 15 of them started testing, because most people will find something. It might even be a low, but that's kind of a good indicator of how many people are actually testing your site, because that's the one thing you can't guarantee with a bug bounty program is how many eyes are testing what parts of the system, whereas at least with a pen test, you can say, hey, can you please, it's a physical person, you can say, hey, can you please test this website very thoroughly? And then you can ask them what they tested, whereas the research is a bit far removed, so it's a bit hard to get that assurance. This is still a POC. We had 15K in the pool for the researchers. So this is the distribution of the rewards. So as you can see, a lot of them were paid out in the 200 range, which is all the low issues that you saw before. We had one or two that were in the higher range, and they're getting around $1,000-ish. And if you take that on a per researcher rate, so 2 weeks worth of work, and this is in USD, the one researcher got over $2,000, which is, especially for countries like India where the currency conversion rate is really good, these guys are making, it's definitely worth their while, in other words, which is where that motivation comes in and how we can tap into that resource pool. The other interesting part is that we didn't actually see that big of an increase in traffic. So 2 weeks before the program versus during the program, this is the traffic difference. And I know Seek have a large amount of traffic that we pump through our sites anyway, and it really depends on how much traffic you have initially on your website. But for us, it wasn't a big increase, and that was one of the things we were worried about, and what the business was worried about is how are we going to handle these researchers? Are they going to take our systems down? Especially because we were testing on production. Does anyone have any questions so far?
Question about the target, the target was your advisor sites. Would you provide them a credential to get like a fake or dummy company and pretend to be an advisor?
Yeah, so if the question, I understand it correctly, we don't need to provide any credentials because people can just sign up themselves on our sites to get credentials to get access. But if you don't have that ability, then you can actually specify the credentials or link to something that will tell them how to log in. So you can actually, if you have a site that needs credentials set up manually, then you can do that as well. There are ways of doing that. Yeah.
One more thought.
Yep.
It said the budget was 15K US. How much of that did you actually spend? Or was it?
That was all of it. Yeah.
Oh, okay, so it all got paid.
Yeah. If it doesn't all get paid out, specifically for BugCrowd anyway, at the time, things change pretty rapidly, but you can then use that same pool for the next test if you want to do another one as well. Yeah. And that's not including the BugCrowd fee as well, which is like, I can't remember now, but not probably half that, so 7 or so. So what we did then after the POC was pretty successful. Obviously, we got a lot of value from it at Seek. Nothing collapsed. Our customers didn't complain too much, so it was like win-win. That proved to the business that we could move forward and try and do a little bit, something a little bit more, which is an ongoing program. So we started that in last year in November, so it's almost been about a year. We started with 50 again, and we ramped up over the last 6 to 12 months, 10 per week, and that kind of just keeps that cadence of new eyes on our applications. And we're still testing on production. So this is what the researchers get invited to. When they get invited to the program, it tells them a little bit about the company and then goes through all the program briefs. So if you scroll down, you'd see all that stuff that I talked about before, reward ranges, in-scope items, all that kind of stuff. And it also gives them an indication of how much they might get paid if they find bugs on your system, because obviously there's lots of programs, and if the reward ranges are very small or there's just kudos, so nothing, then they might go elsewhere. So it's all about managing that kind of expectation as well. And obviously the more rewards you have, the more skilled researchers are probably going to likely to come and test your stuff. So you can start off really small and then ramp up the reward ranges as well. So there's a lot of flexibility in how you run the programs.
How do you manage two people finding the same vulnerability?
So
Who gets the payout and who gets, sorry, someone else found it first?
yeah, so duplicate issues, it's paid out for only the first person who finds it. And if you have
Do you publish that out to the rest of the group saying, don't stress about this issue?
so that's where it comes into, not really. So they get an indication when they submit the issue. We say this is a dupe, here's the link to the duplicate to prove that it is a duplicate. Because there's a bit of a trust thing there, because you could just be like, oh, we found this internally like 5 days ago, sorry, can't pay you. So you have to be pretty honest, and you don't want to, it's all about keeping up the relationships as well, because if you burn 1 or 2 relationships with a researcher who's doing really good work for you, they're probably going to tell all their researchers, friends, not to work on your program, and then you're not getting the value out of the program that you want. So it's very much about keeping that relationship and honesty and transparency. And then that's the other reason, if you can't fix vulnerabilities quickly, then you start getting into that where a lot of the submissions might be duplicates if you're never fixing anything. And that is a bit annoying for researchers, obviously. You can also break up into different tiers, which is what we've done. So we have one tier, which is obviously a lot less. So our kind of internal domains or stuff we don't care about, or like a static website that's hosted somewhere else. And then your tier 1s, which is maybe where all your sensitive data is and all that kind of stuff. You're willing to pay more for that because you care about issues more on those websites. How are we going for time as well? What time is it? 1:45. So 15 minutes? Okay, I've got to keep going. So this is I might skip. So this is the average time taken. So you can see the critical issues are very quickly being remediated. Severe, pretty quickly being remediated within 2 weeks. Moderate, again, it's a bit more. So this is kind of a really good way of indicating how well you can fix and respond to issues. And if you don't, then you might get something like this, where we had an issue that's been around for about 12 months and researchers get linked to that issue so they know how long it's been around. This guy obviously was going to buy a cake and sing happy birthday to this vulnerability because it was turning a year soon. So he was obviously just joking, but it's a bit frustrating from a researcher point of view. This is a graph of our JIRA issues so all of the issues that are found on Seek. This is low, high, medium, everything. And you can tell when we did the POC and when we started the ongoing program. So really good spikes, but you can also see this green line is the remediated issues. So we're also constantly fixing issues as well. So eventually over time you want these kind of to converge a little bit. But initially you're going to see a massive volume of issues coming through, especially if your maturity is not awesome. I think I've already really gone through a lot of these. The only one I wanted to point out was that if you are testing on production, you're going to be triggering operational alerts. So make sure your developer teams are aware of testers and have backup strategies in place. They don't always follow the rules, so as I said, this is some of the researchers that were following the rules about putting a specific user agent string in their request when they were testing, because we want to know who was a tester, who wasn't. And this is obviously the people who didn't. So you can see that the brief is really just there for a bit of a guidance. You have to have backup strategies in case. So another one is like, even if it's even if the domain is not in scope, they still might test the site, but then you don't have to reward them for those issues that they report if you don't want to. And obviously, every now and again, you'll get some researchers that really aren't happy with the response you've given, and they get a little bit aggressive sometimes. So you just have to be a little bit tongue-in-cheek and just kind of understand that they might think that they're getting screwed over or something like that. So I just got a few examples of issues now, and that's really finishing up the presentation today. So has anyone heard of an XML Entity Attack? This is going to get a little bit technical now, so please try and follow. Facebook have had one of these before. It was a really popular issue last year with the bug bounty community. So again, once one person finds it and starts blogging about it, then every site is tested for this one particular issue. So essentially it involves around, if your website takes in a document, like a Word document, and then parses that document, you may have this issue. So what happens is, with a document, you can actually unzip it, a docx. You can actually unzip it and you get a bunch of files. And within one of those files, you can actually put XML in there, because docx is all XML based. And what they do is you put this external entity, which refers to a server that you control with this kind of file that's hosted there, payload.dtd. So you set up a file server with that file in it, and you have another entity in there which is extracting contents of a file. So in this case, it was running on the server that was parsing the Word documents was running on a Windows server. But in the case of Linux, so some people, in the case of Facebook, they had it running on a Linux server. So you can get kind of etc passwords file and dump that out. So all you have to do is set up this thing so it's listening. Just a simple Python script will do the job. Upload a resume and then wait for it to kind of parse the document. And then when it parses the document, it'll actually execute that XML script and send to the server the contents of that file that you requested. So essentially you can get out a lot of sensitive information. In the worst case, you can actually get remote code execution. You can do like server-side request forgery where you're hitting different internal URLs. So that was a pretty bad one. This one was actually really, really good, and not in a good way, but very interesting. So this is kind of like an insecure direct object reference, but not really. It was a bit of a weird one. So in one of our apps, you can obviously, this is in Advertiser Center where you post the jobs. Essentially, you can invite users to be part of your account. So you add their email address in, they get an email saying, hey, you can activate your account. When they click on that link, you get taken to a page where you can put in your password. It all looks pretty innocent until you look at the request that gets sent on that password complete. So you've got your new password. So it's all pretty standard stuff. First name, last name, email, new password. You got this security link thing, which obviously seems to tie to that particular link that you got sent in the email. And then you have their user ID as well. What the researcher found is that the code wasn't actually checking this security GUID, and that you could just enumerate through that user ID and change everyone's password on all the accounts. So that was actually really like very, very impactful, very obscure, because you had to have this one user settings turned on to be able to get to this page, which is probably why a lot of other pen tests and other bug bounty programs in the past, because this came up in the second program that we ran, so even the first program didn't pick this up. So it just shows you that continually testing your apps will still find quite severe issues. This one's a good one as well. So we're moving into AWS. We're moving a lot of our APIs publicly facing. I didn't find a vulnerability, but that's never a really good way to start a report. But once, you'll see what I mean in a second. So this guy said infected server, question mark. This is not obviously our main domain. It's a domain that we use to host a lot of our internal non-client facing stuff. So it really shouldn't be public facing. So it's not a massive impact for us. It's one of our tier 2 domains. But obviously, what I found when I dug the this server or domain is that it was linked to an IP address that was in Amazon. So a 5.2 address is normally an Amazon one, which is pretty common for us because we're on AWS. And what happened is this remoter.skinfra.xyz was used by us at some point, but that IP address was then discarded at some point, and picked up by another person who decided to put a website containing some not so nice material on there. So essentially we were hosting on our own domain a porn website, which is not good. So we fixed that pretty quickly. So things like this come up quite often in bug bounty programs because they have a lot of tooling that automates a lot of this stuff for us. So this is the offending one here, and all you have to do is really just remove that from your Route 53 or your DNS server. So remembering to clean up after yourself as well. I'm really quickly going to get through this one, and then that's about it. And if we have time for Q&A, I'll answer it outside. So we had this come through, which is kind of out of scope in some ways because it wasn't really in scope, wasn't affecting one of our domains that we had in scope. But again, we definitely wanted to know about this issue, so we end up paying this guy out regardless of the fact that it wasn't really in scope. So it involved Twitter SSO plus a customer service portal service that we use equals access to our internal corporate Slack channels, which is obviously quite sensitive information in there. So we have a ticketing system. All tickets go to support@seek.com.au. They have an option to sign up with Twitter in this customer service thing to be able to see emails that you've sent to support, so you can check on the status of these emails. So here you can see that emails are to support@seek.com.au and from the user's email address that you log in via your Twitter. You might get lost a little bit. Hopefully it makes sense a little bit towards the end because this is really complicated. And it took me probably at least half a day to figure out what's going on here, even myself. So if we go back here, we sign in with Twitter. And we actually use something like this, no-reply@slack.com. And what we found is Twitter doesn't enforce email verification. So you can actually sign up to Twitter using whatever email you want. And the SSO OAuth implementation wasn't checking your email address. So you can see things they're not getting is their email address. So it's like, oh, what's going on here? So it means this customer service portal wasn't actually checking if it was a valid email address. But how does that get me anywhere? So now it's actually logged me in as no-reply@slack.com on this customer service portal, and we're seeing emails from to support and from no reply. In the Twitter documentation, it does say that you can actually get this email, but it will return null if it's not verified. So that's obviously something they weren't checking there. So at the moment, we can see emails from support to any email address because we can just sign up on Twitter with that email address. That's not that interesting. Like, people's support emails aren't that sensitive normally. Our customers normally just, how do you post a job ad or things like that. But what we do is we do use Slack, and Slack offers a feature where you can find what teams you're associated with. So in this case, you can get an email from Slack at no-reply@slack.com.au with a list of the things that you have access to. So in this case, the researcher was able to add in support@seek.com.au in here, see the email in the customer service portal to figure out we had access to Slack, got the email that gave him access to join our Seek Slack because the emails from there also go into this portal, because they're from noreply@slack.com.au to support@seek.com.au, and he was able to gain access to our corporate Slack channel like that. So that crazy number of different things that all got put together and chained up into this ridiculous long thing. And I guess the main point I want to make here is that you can never automate that. Like, you can never automate something that does that, but what you can do, and this just shows the importance of looking at each thing in particular in its own right. So we thought, oh, this portal wasn't that sensitive, it's just answering customer support emails. It doesn't tie into any of our corporate stuff at all. Turns out it might actually do that depending on how things are configured. Also, that was our Slack wasn't on the corporate plan just yet. It is now, but it was allowing this to happen. So any domain on @seek.com.au to make it easier for our employees to sign up. So having that option on was also what allowed this to happen in the first place. So it just shows you, like, if you put a lot of controls around each individual thing, it's much harder to do these chaining of issues. And that is it. So hopefully I didn't go over time.